I guess we can start. Thank you for your time here. We are recording the podcast with Peter Merholz, the author of Org Design for DesignOrgs.
I'm Peter Merholz. I've been working in digital design for over 25 years. About 4 years ago, I co-wrote this book, Org Design for DesignOrgs. And pretty much since then, my work has focused a lot on helping companies establish healthier and more effective design organizations.
That sounds great. So you have already mentioned that you are helping companies to build more effective design organizations. I don't know what problems companies usually come with, what they ask you for. So maybe you just can.
Yeah, it almost always starts with recruiting and hiring. Even in this pandemic time, there are some companies that are aggressively trying to scale design organizations. And so I come in to help them plan their recruiting and hiring. When you do that, that ends up touching on a lot of other organizational aspects. So in order to recruit and hire well, you need to have good job descriptions and good role definitions, which they often don't. So I often help them rewrite their job descriptions and role definitions. You often need to, in order to do that, and I know this is of interest, obviously, to Vectorly, you need to have a sense of kind of career progression, right? What is the difference between a junior and a mid-level and a senior and a lead? Those distinctions aren't often clear. So I help them architect a framework for thinking about career progression so that we can then write better job descriptions. I end up working a fair bit on recruiting and hiring practices and processes, like how do you structure the interviews? What questions do you ask when? Who is asking those questions? How do you assess portfolios or the responses to the questions that you're getting? So helping them think through that. Those types of assessments also tie in to stuff I know Vectorly is interested in, because you basically are looking at different skills and abilities. You need to be able to do a good job assessing consistently, right? So let's say you're looking at someone's interaction design, you want to have everyone looking at that interaction design to be able to grade it similarly. If one person says on a scale of 1 to 5, if one person says, oh, this person's only a 3 in interaction design, and while somebody else says actually they're a 5 in interaction design, then you have some other challenges that you need to address in terms of making sure everyone has the same framework for assessing skills. So you start with recruiting and hiring. The way I often talk about it is recruiting and hiring. When you pull that thread, the whole org sweater unravels because it touches on so many other parts of the organization.
Beyond the part of the recruiting, why do companies can need this leveling system? I know that in your book you've mentioned 2 other things like reputation and retention. Can you just get on that as well?
Yeah, so there's a lot that a coherent leveling system supports. I've begun to think of levels as a good levels framework as kind of this service, like an API almost, or that plugs into the rest of your organization. So with good leveling, you can do the recruiting and hiring better, as we talked about. You can write better job descriptions, and you also have a better sense of what roles you even need in your organization, right? Because you know kind of where you're maybe overweight. If you have too many seniors and leads, maybe you now need to bring on some juniors and mid-levels, or vice versa. Leveling frameworks also, I think, help with team composition. And it depends on your philosophy, but when building design teams, I like to have a mix, right? And a mix of people who are actually working closely together. So a good levels framework helps you understand the experiences that people are bringing, and that you're combining people with complementary experiences and skill sets. And then you asked about reputation and retention. On the retention front, a good leveling framework enables you to do professional development for your staff, right? So you bring in someone as a mid-level. At some point, you're going to want to grow them to a senior, and they're going to want to grow as a senior. And so a levels framework charts that path of growth, so that designer understands what's expected of them as they grow. And so that helps you with things like performance reviews, because you can have your goal setting can be aligned with that professional development. And then it's also helpful for things like training and education or learning and development, because depending on how people are growing, say, in their skill set, you can then create a learning and development program that allows people to skills build, right, to fill those gaps as they're seeking to grow. So it connects with a lot of different activities within the organization.
And usually at what, I don't know, like size of the design team, you in your book, you also mentioned a thing like that at some time, the design team transforms to the design organization. At what size does it usually happens? And at what size does the level and system come into place when it needs to be deployed, according to your practice and expertise?
As long as a design team is fewer than about 10 people, you can kind of get away with being pretty informal and pretty conversational among the group of those 10 designers. Usually you'll have a design leader. Maybe once you get to 10, you might also need a manager, because you don't want all the designers. You don't want 9 designers to report to one leader if possible, right? You'd want to split that up a bit. Once you get above 10, and definitely once you're in like 15 people, you now have no longer what I would call a design team. You have a design organization, right? Because in order to have 15 people, you're going to have at least 2 sub-teams of 7 people, and maybe more, right? You might break it up into 3 teams of 4 and 5. And once you have multiple sub-teams, you now can't approach things informally. You need to introduce more formal structures, because you're not all able to just gather around easily and talk to one another. Team size, organization size is one of those things that, if you're familiar with kind of network theory, the more people you add, it grows exponentially, right? So it's not twice as hard to communicate with 14 people as it is with 7 people. It's an exponent of 2 as hard, right? It becomes exponential in terms of communicating with 14 people as opposed to 7 people, because of all the interconnections that they have. And so it's around that kind of 12, 13, 14 person size that you need to start bringing in various kinds of systems and structures to support scale. A levels framework is definitely one of those. Quality frameworks and just other practices that allow you to continue to grow in an orderly fashion. If you don't have frameworks and tools in place, what ends up happening is, and I've seen this, right, where I've come into design organizations, very large design organizations, that might have 100 people in it, and they might be in like 5 teams of 20, each with their own leader. And these teams all operate very differently from one another, even though they're technically part of the same design organization. And they operate very differently because no one put in place anything to drive that kind of coherence and consistency. You wait until then to start implementing systems, it's pretty much too late. Or, I mean, you got to do it if you haven't, but that's the kind of thing that should have been done. That's the kind of thing that should have been done much earlier. So I would say around 12 to 15 people, you start building out a levels framework, you start building out a career ladder, you start building out an understanding of roles and skills and how these things coordinate. You start thinking about, when you're 10 or fewer, you're going to mostly have generalist designers. But when you get over 10, now you're starting to think about, well, how do I incorporate UX research? How do I incorporate content strategy and content design? How do I incorporate design operations? You start looking at other practices to bring into your design team, because you now have a scale that you can support them in the work that they're doing. So the last thing I'll say when you kind of hit this design organization thing, and I mentioned this role just a moment ago, is design operations or design program management becomes essential. So once you get to about 13, 14, 15 people, you want to have a design program manager who basically is a partner with the design leader to handle the operational realities of that team. Because if you don't have that design program manager, then all those operational challenges, communication, coordination, what tools are we going to use? What software are we going to buy? How do we coordinate over Slack? How do we coordinate over Figma? All those kinds of questions. If we want to bring on a contractor, if we want to hire an agency, who's responsible for doing that? those types of questions, if you don't have a program manager or other design ops person, end up becoming the responsibility of the design leader. And because they have to get done. Operations work can't be ignored. But if the design leader now is doing all this operations work, they can't do the thing that people want of them, which is creative leadership and those types of things. So that's why at around that size, if you don't have a program manager, what ends up happening is your design director just is a glorified program manager themselves.
You mentioned that it's hard to handle this communication complexity, but what other types of complexities arises when the team becomes that big?
The first thought I'm having is quality management becomes really difficult. Quality is a tough concept in design, right? So designers often work as product designers, UX designers. We often work with engineers, and engineers have a very clear understanding of quality, right? In engineering, quality means no bugs, uptime, speed of performance, right? It's very straightforward. It's basically how well are the machines performing. In design, we don't really have a quality equivalent, right? When we think about design quality, we think about, well, it's good. Well, what does good mean? Good is subjective and contextual. And what can be good in one context might be maybe not bad, but might only be mediocre in another context. And so one of the challenges I see design organizations have once they reach a certain size is they need to be very explicit in terms of how they define quality. Again, when you're small, quality can be defined informally. The design leader, through review and critique and feedback and mentorship, is essentially communicating quality. As you get larger, if you keep doing it that way, and this is what most organizations do. I've worked with organizations with 500 people and no consistent quality definition. What ends up happening there is quality becomes defined locally by whatever kind of nearest design leader there is. But you might have two design leaders who don't have the same understanding of quality. They might have different things that they value. And what that means is that the entire design doesn't end up having a coherent shape or feeling because of the different understandings of quality in the different parts of the design organization. So one of the things that you need to start doing around that 15 to person size of a design organization is start putting in place quality standards. And the challenge is design teams need to define quality for themselves. There's not a industry standard quality definition the way there is with engineering. Design quality is going to be around matters of brand. How well does the design evoke the personality that you are trying to deliver? Design quality has to be responsive to user needs, right? So how well does the design serve what our users need? Design quality and the tasks that they're trying to accomplish. Design quality needs to be around business value, right? How well do these designs serve our business needs? Are they hitting the kinds of metrics that as a company we're going for? And so there ends up being a lot of factors that contribute to design quality that will be different from company to company, but are important for each organization to define, so that you don't get into discussions around design where the feedback or critique is just based on preference, right? If you don't have a clear quality understanding, what ends up happening with design is that a designer will show their work that they think is pretty good, but they might get this critical feedback, but that critical feedback is going to be born of somebody's preference, somebody's idea of what it is it should be or what we're going for, but not a consistent, broad understanding. And it becomes very in the moment, right? We need to make sure that we have clear quality definitions so that everybody understands what good looks like here in this organization, and we can remove this kind of personal preference, personal bias, highly subjective taste judgments from the conversation. Because if that's what you end up working on, you kind of end up spinning because it's not solid enough. It doesn't give you a foundation with which to really move with confidence. A good quality definition means that designers know what it is they're aiming for and they can just charge at it. Non-existent quality definition is designers never know when it's good enough, and they're hesitant in their work because they don't quite know what it is they're aiming for.
And can you communicate like the concept of quality through the leveling system? Because it is defined by the skills as well, and you can have like like skills for doing the craft. And what have you experienced, like communicating the quality standards for different skills through the leveling system?
I'm thinking about that, not offhand. So there's a relationship there in that someone's skills ability, right? If you are a very good designer and we rated you very good through some clear metric or rubric, that will be because we've seen that designer deliver quality work, however we've defined quality. So there's definitely a connection there, right? Your highly skilled designers should be producing higher quality work. As you're saying it, though, I don't know if I've ever drawn kind of a straight line between a definition of quality and career level. Not that couldn't be done. That's just not a connection I've made. I think I've usually made a two-step connection between like, you're doing quality work. That means you've demonstrated skills ability, and that means you are now we can now consider you for a particular level in a certain level in your career.
What parts of skills could be assessed like with these skill metrics? Like, what types of skill are usually being measured? I don't know. You mentioned in your book like there are certain skills for craft, certain skills for business impact of the designer, certain skill of managing people, and can you just briefly describe them and tell how they change as the designer gets more senior, and what type of skill become more important?
Yeah. So last year, I had the fortune of doing a really robust skills framework for one of the companies I was working for. So I got to think a lot about this. And in a past life, I was an information architect. And so I tend to use the tools of information architecture to make sense of the world. So I developed a skills taxonomy. And that skills taxonomy originally had 3 groupings, and we added a 4th. And I'll explain that. But the original 3 groupings were, you had craft skills. So that's going to be what people consider kind of the core design skills: visual design, interaction design, information architecture, those kinds of things. Then we had strategy skills. And we had 3 strategy skills. Basically experience strategy, or kind of user strategy, design strategy, business strategy, and what we ended up calling technical acumen, a little different than technical strategy. But the idea behind that was the 3 strategy skills mapped to the 3 circles in that kind of classic model of user needs, business needs, technical abilities. Originally, I'd had strategy as part of a craft skill, and I ended up pulling it out because it felt like it stood on its own. And then the third area were what I sometimes call professional skills or interpersonal skills. In many organizations, you hear them called soft skills. I'm not a fan of that phrase because one, soft skills are actually often harder than the hard skills. And soft skills also, I think, encourage us to diminish their importance. They're soft, they're squishy, when in fact they're, as I'll say in a moment to answer the second part of your question, they become the most important skills. But in your interpersonal or professional skills, that's where you have things like communication and presentation skills, domain understanding skills, facilitation and like leadership skills. How do you bring people along? Planning and structuring skills, like how are you at planning work, that kind of thing. So we have these 3 buckets of skills: craft skills, strategy skills, and professional skills. So now to answer your question, earlier in your career, the focus is on the craft skills, right? You're building your kind of core craft skill ability. You're getting good at the basics of design. visual design, interaction design, information architecture, or let's say you're a researcher, you're learning user research, interviewing and structuring research, and how to draw insights and analysis from research. If you're a content designer, right, you're getting really thoughtful about words and language and taxonomies and labels and structuring content and those types of things. So, when you're entry level, mid level, through senior, the focus is really on craft skills with some understanding of those interpersonal skills, because you need to start growing those also from the beginning, particularly around communication. Something that designers are often not taught in school or wherever they learn. They're not taught how to do well is how to communicate about their work, how to articulate their rationales for the decisions that they make. And that's a skill that you want to start building pretty early. But the focus is on craft skills. Once you pass senior, though, you're pretty well skilled at that point. Not that you can't continue to grow those skills, but you, as a senior designer, you should be advanced to expert in at least a couple of your chosen skills. And that's now what you kind of take to the bank from your practice standpoint. So once you cross that line and you start going from senior to either becoming a manager or a leader, that's when the strategy skills and those professional skills really start coming to the fore. You maintain the craft skills. You don't need to necessarily keep growing those, but you need to really ramp up your ability to think strategically, to understand the strategic context in which your work exists. And as a designer, the obvious starting point is experience strategy and kind of that user-centered strategy, right? How is what we're learning about our users informing the direction that we should go in? But that's not sufficient. You need to understand the business strategy that you're operating within. And at least if you're working in a technical environment, as most kind of product or UX designers are, you need to have, again, what we call technical acumen. So that doesn't mean you need to be able to code. There's nothing wrong with that, but you don't need to be able to code, but you need to understand enough about the material of the technology that you're working with that you know how to get the most out of it. So you're growing those strategy skills. And then when it comes to the interpersonal skills, what you're really focusing on is leadership skills. And something I've come to understand in the past few years is that leadership is relationship, right? The best leaders are those who are the best at relationship building, managing relationships with other people. And that's where these interpersonal skills become so important because they, those interpersonal skills are going to become the medium by which you lead. And so whether it's communication, oftentimes you shift from communication like in the room to presentation, and storytelling becomes an important leadership skill. Facilitation, how do you get a group of other people together and lead them towards a common goal, becomes a really important skill. Subject matter expertise, depending on the environment. I've been working a bunch in financial services where you can only go so far if you don't understand the details, the content of banking. And so you now need to become an expert in banking if you want to continue to grow, right? And I consider that a professional skill as opposed to a craft skill. Planning, right? The more senior you get, the bigger the area, the bigger the kind of the surface area that you're covering. Yeah. And so you now need to develop skills on how do you plan multiple work streams working together towards a common goal, right? When you're a senior designer, you're working on your thing and you just have to plan yourself moving forward. But as you grow, you now have multiple teams that are working side by side, and you need to be able to understand how you can help them all move forward together.
I see. And you mentioned a thing, then the organization is truly big, and imagine we imagine some sort of the head of design. And are there any problem with the middle management designers? Because designers are usually not taught to be managers, and they're not usually taught to be, I don't know, planning and so forth, because they all start with the craft. What they need to do to be the better managers? I don't know, should they use, what tools they may start using just to switch the mindset and just is up this way?
I've thought a lot about this. Because whether it's management or kind of leadership, so there's a couple of paths a designer can go on. Let's say you're a junior, then you're a mid-level, then you're a senior designer. And after a senior designer, there's usually a choice to make. Am I going to become a manager and have people report to me that I manage, which I think is primarily what your question's about. But then you could also, at least in many organizations, become, you don't necessarily manage people, but you lead them, right? You become a team lead.
Yeah.
And so you're not managing them, but you're directing them, right? You still have other designers that you are trying to orient towards a goal. In both of those situations, whether you become a manager or leader, the thing that I find designers have the hardest time understanding as they make that transition is that it's no longer about them and their craft skills. That's why those professional and interpersonal skills become way more important, because the skills that got you there, right? All those craft skills that were the reason people loved you and the reason you got promotions and the reason that you got raises and plaudits and all that kind of stuff. Those skills they're not immaterial anymore, but they're not the skills you need to do the work now that you're having to do. The skills that got you there aren't the skills that you need going forward. You now need to really grow your communication and relationship and coordination skills, because your job as a leader or manager isn't to do the work. You have teams to do the work. Your job is to help them do the work the best they can. And so you need to figure out how to enable and empower a team to be the best it can be. And one of the common challenges that new managers or new leaders face when they get into a sticky situation, right? Now they're a manager or leader, they've got a team humming along, but then something happens, something goes wrong. And gut instinct of the new manager is to roll up their sleeves and kind of get in there and just solve the problem themselves, because that's what they, 3 months ago, that's what they were doing. And so now they're like, well, I still can do that. I'm just going to go do that. The problem is when that manager does it, especially depending on how they approach it, but when that manager does that, they're now no longer helping the team be the best it can be, right? Because the team grows through learning how to address these challenges. And if the manager just comes in and fixes it, well, now we haven't taught the team how to address it. And so that new manager needs to, instead of trying to get in there and just solve the problem directly, they need to help the team figure out how to solve the problem. Because I have two kind of leadership memes, and they relate to management as well. One that we touched on is leadership is relationship. When you become a leader, what you're doing is you're relating to other people now. You're communicating all the time. Design leadership is mostly talking, not rolling up your sleeves and doing. And so that's one big theme of leadership is you need to think about how you relate to other people and the tools that you use for relationships, such as communication. The other thing to think about, though, when it comes to leadership is leverage. Right? The point of becoming a leader is that figure out how you can leverage yourself through the team. You're a bottleneck. You're only one person who can do only one person's worth of work. Your team is the thing that can really maximize kind of that potential. And so when the design leader dives in and just rolls up their sleeve to do the work, they're no longer being leveraged. And they're no longer getting as much out of team in the situation as they could. So instead, the design leader needs to pull back and figure out, how do I maintain leverage? What can I do to get these 5, 6, 7 people that I'm leading to do, 10 times what I could do as an individual? That's what you want to focus on.
And what can you be a bit more, add more details to the thing? What I need to focus on. Like, I need to provide more feedback. I don't need to train them for new skills, or how to make people do more with my help. Maybe some general advice would be perfect.
So I teach a workshop where I've identified the 4 archetypes of the design leader. And again, it also tends to hold true for managers. And those archetypes are the coach, the diplomat, the champion, and the architect. And what we're primarily talking about is this coach archetype, which is managing down, right? But the reason I use the word coach is very purposeful, because coaches, the job of a coach is to get the most out of their team, right?
Yeah.
Help their team perform. And so you engage in coaching practices, in coaching behaviors, and that can be different depending on the situation and depending on the individual. So certain things that you want to do, I don't think coaches should be getting in there and doing the work, but coaches can teach the work. They can mentor, they can guide, they can help people figure out how to solve those problems themselves. Again, they can't get in there and solve the problems, but they can poke and probe and ask questions, right? Coaches can, through critique and review and their feedback, help others understand what's expected of them, what good looks like in our organization. Coaches, something I think that leader role needs to maintain more focus on is less the day-to-day work and more the vision of where we're headed. I think too often, particularly new design leaders, new design managers, stay kind of rooted in the work itself. Whereas I think the best coaches and the best leaders are those that provide some sense of where it is we're going. And that provides this orientation for the team of like, okay, this is where we're headed. It helps inspire them. It helps align them, right? You want to give the team something to shoot for, something to aim for, an interesting, meaningful goal. So those are the kinds of practices I would encourage managers to think more about.
I see. That's great. You also been talking about a thing called the super individual contributor, and the thing that there is not only a way for a designer to become a manager as his career path elevates and grows. Can you tell a bit more what it means? Like, well, who is this who is this super individual?
So something I noticed over this past year is the emergence of what I call the super senior IC, or super senior individual contributor role. Not to say this role hasn't existed before. In fact, some companies have had this type of role for decades. But in the last couple of years, I think it's really growing. And the idea behind the super senior individual contributor, I mentioned earlier the kind of different paths that a person can go on once they become after they're a senior designer. They can become a manager, and then become a director, and they're part of their responsibility is growing teams and managing teams and bringing people up. Or they can become, at least in some organizations, more and more senior individual contributor, a lead designer or a principal designer, and then in some organizations they call the most senior one a design architect. And so if you think about that leadership path, the reason that's emerged is I think what's happened is these design organizations scale. So, and by scale, I mean they've got 60, 80, 100 people in it, right? And these design organizations, there's a head of design, they have their design directors, and then they have the people doing the work. What's happened is the head of design and the design directors are realizing that they don't have the time or the brain space to focus on creative leadership and kind of creative strategy, right? When you're running an organization of 100 people, or even as a design director, you have maybe got a group of 20, most of your time is spent managing that group, or I talked about relationships earlier, maintaining relationships with your peers, right? So if you're a head of design, you're spending a lot of time with the head of product and the head of engineering and other leaders. If you're a design director, you're spending time with your product partners and your engineering partners. So you're either kind of relating out, or you're managing down, you're helping your team grow, you're doing one-on-ones and all that kind of managerial work. And what's happened is, well, let me say one other thing. So a head of designer, those design directors, though, are often expected to also be creative leaders and strategic leaders. And they want to do it, they just don't have time, because there's one thing that only they can do, which is really like focus on that organization and make sure things are right for the team. And so what you're seeing more and more of are design organizations realizing like, oh, we don't have anyone leading the creative charge, leading that kind of strategic effort. And so they're bringing on these super senior ICs who are people with 10, 15, 20 years experience, who are very strategic thinkers, maybe service design types, who know how to connect complex, complicated systems together. They're bringing them in and not giving them any direct reports. They have no management responsibility. Their job is to focus on the creative and strategic aspects of the team that were getting ignored because everyone else was focused on just kind of the basics of keeping things moving forward.
They become a sort of the knowledge brokers for the team, yeah? Some sort of data handling.
Sometimes, yeah. I mean, if you've got a few of them, depending on the size of the team, yeah, they become links. They can become really helpful links in terms of connecting work that's happening in these different parts of the organization that others might just not have. Again, for me, a lot of the challenge around design, particularly design leadership, is time management. And because design management and design leadership is still relatively new inside of a lot of organizations, there's not we still lack a general awareness of just how much time it takes for a design manager to do the basics of their job. We think we can just keep piling on more and more responsibility, and they can only do so much. And so we're starting to realize, we need this super senior IC role, much like engineering teams have architects, software architects, or other types of, I mean, we've seen this in engineering organizations for 20 or 30 years, these super senior individual contributors. They've had that role for a long time. It's still being established in design practices.
Actually, at the big engineering teams, there is a VP of engineering usually, and the CTO, and the CTO is usually responsible for the architecture, the technology, and the VP of engineering is more for the organization and the people who work. So actually,
exactly.
It's pretty much the same. That was actually the great, actually all the questions, Pete. So it was really nice. What do you think?
This is great. As I said when we spoke originally a couple of weeks ago, I'm intrigued by what Vectorly has to offer. I've somehow been able to make, if not a career, at least a significant part of my consulting practice around things like career progression, career growth. I think it's one of the frontiers for design because, as I said, I was just saying, right, this kind of, design at scale is still pretty new. And so we're all figuring out what the implications are to have design teams that are 50, 80, 150, 500 people. Because, we just, that's literally within the last decade. That we've seen that kind of scale and scope of effort. And so figuring out how do you enable design at that kind of scale? Yeah, because as you scale, the challenge is if you don't have systems in place, if you don't have smart practices in place, things just collapse in on themselves. And so I'm, again, as I said earlier as well, my background in information architecture, I like thinking about systems and structures and relationships. And so I find that I can apply that thinking to these organizational challenges as a way to try to make sense of how do we enable scale without, and this is crucial, maybe this will be my last thought, because one of the things that happens with scale is often is that it gets rote. Everything gets the same. You let the systems run the organization. And that's not what I want, right? That's basically bureaucracy. Bureaucracy was created to manage scale. But as we know, bureaucracy also stultifies innovation, creativity, all the things that particularly we as designers value. And so there's this delicate balance to work out of how do you enable scale with structures that are lightweight enough that they don't
Press.
constrain
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
capabilities. They don't constrain the work, because we still want, particularly as designers, that ability to engage in that playful, creative spark, that uncertainty that is the magic of what it is we do. And so that for me is kind of my mission, is trying to operate
Balance.
in that weird liminal space between the structures that enable scale and that doing so in a way that allows for that creativity and that spark.
That's very true. And I actually love the idea that you said about the network effect, because and you actually, when the design, everything in design is actually about communicating the ideas, because what we actually do, we're just taking the knowledge out of our heads and just put it into the design, into some user experience, or into some kind of code when building any sort of the product. And so when the complexity of this communication, as design organization scales, and you need to handle this, it's really hard. That's one of the
Right.
problems. So
exactly. Well, this was excellent. Thank you so much, Paul.